Michael here, and today this is going to be part 4 of our infantry system tutorial. So for this particular episode, what I was thinking of doing is actually going through and showing you how to set up a couple of widgets that you can use to then actually display some of the data that we have within our infantry system already. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is inside the infantry system folder, I'm just going to create a new folder. I'm just going to call this one UI, just so we can keep all the infantry system stuff together. Once we've done that, we're going to go ahead and create a new widget, and for that's just going to be a standard user widget. Now there is common UI, which I certainly do recommend, but obviously there is quite a lot in there, and for the scope of this particular tutorial it's not something I'm wanting to go over just at this moment in time. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through how you can set up just using the bog standard widgets without any of the common UI stuff. So with that created, this is going to be the widget that's actually going to be representing the item in some shape or form within the UI space. So I'm going to call this one widget underscore what I'll do item, call it item entry widget. Now the way that widgets themselves work is you can have child widgets of a parent widget. Now the way you set that up is a little bit different. Generally you tend to have to use sort of named slots and things like that. So if you are looking to want to possibly have different widgets to display your items, then that is something you might want to sort of look into. For this, we're just going to use a single item entry widget for now. So with that open, I'm just going to go ahead and open up the item base as well, just so we can have a quick check on the information that's in there, so we can kind of see how it is that we're wanting to display our items. Now at this particular stage you kind of have a little bit of flexibility in terms of how it is you want it to look. So if we wanted to, we could incorporate the icon and have it where it loads the icon and sets that within the widget. Alternatively, we can just get the name and the quantity and display those, and once you've kind of seen how you pull data from the item objects, at that point it's up to you how you want to use the data that's in there. So I'm just going to populate the name and the quantity just because we don't have any icons in here. But again, if you are wanting to use the actual icon texture, it's just a case of popping in an image and then setting that from the texture that's in the item base. So normally the way I like to start off quite a few of my widgets is just with an overlay. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do here. So I'm going to drop that in, and as I mentioned, we're going to do the name and then the quantity. So I'm going to put those in a horizontal line, so I'm going to go ahead and add in a horizontal box as well, and that's going to be dropped onto the overlay. With that done, we can then go ahead and add in a text box. I suppose we need 2 of those, so I'll add 2 of those in there. So the first one, this is just going to be item name, so I'm just going to add a kind of like a default thing in there, just called item name. So generally if you see where it says item name anywhere, then chances are it's not updated the name somewhere, so it just makes it a little bit easier to spot when that's happened. Similarly with this, I'm just going to do x0. Generally again, we shouldn't normally be presenting an item that has no quantity, so if we see x0 then we know there's something wrong there. I'm going to stick a little bit of padding on the right just to add a bit of space between these. And then what we can do, up near the top right here we have this where it says fill screen. If we actually select it to desired on screen, that's kind of resizes everything as if it's going to be what it's like when it's not been set to fill or anything like that, which can be quite nice to give a little bit more of a representation of what this particular widget is going to look like. Okay, so with that done, I think at this point all I'm going to do is just add an image on the background, so that's just going to be above the horizontal box. That's just so it's placed behind, and I'm going to go ahead and set that to fill. Now at the moment the text is white instead of the background, so I'm going to go ahead and update the background colour as well. We'll set that to kind of like a dark grey I think, and we'll add a little bit of opacity to it. And then lastly, I'm going to go ahead and stick a little bit of padding around this side of the text itself. Okay. I'm not liking how the font there is bold, so I'm just going to change that to regular. Again, you have all the flexibility you want. You can get this to look however you like. So all I'm doing though, just keeping it fairly basic, just so we can go through some of the basic concepts. Okay, so with that done, what we kind of need to do now is actually set up the functions that will update that those particular elements within our widget. So I'm just going to delete those 3 temp nodes. Okay, so looking in the variables tab, we don't actually currently have access to these, so we do need to just make these variables. And whilst I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and actually rename them as well. So the quantity1, and the item name. I am going to untick the background image, so that's not a variable. That's just so it doesn't show up in the list. If you are wanting to change the background, then you may want to keep that as a variable, so you can update that as well if you wanted to. Again, we may come back to that and change it, but for now we're just focusing on the actual text. Okay, so in terms of this item entry widget, what I then want to do is actually add a variable to this, and that's just going to be item object, and it's going to be the item object, I think it's just the item base, yeah. And that's just going to be our item base class that we have. We are going to go ahead and set that to instance editable and expose on spawn. And the reason we're going to do that is so when we actually go to create this particular element, we can pass that an item object that's going to be representing to the widget as we create it. So now we've done that, what we want to then do is actually add something on construct to update the widget itself. So we can pull in that item object, and I'm going to convert that to a validated get. And if it's valid, we can then start looking at updating some of these. So I'm going to create a function called update text. Again, you can call this whatever you like. Actually, what I'm going to do, I'm going to move the validated get for the item object inside the update text. And that's just so it's a little bit tidier, so that way we can just call the update text function whenever we want. And if we needed to, it'll automatically handle if there's an item object that's valid. Now, from here, we can get the quantity from the item object and the item name. Now, at the moment, the item name itself isn't a private variable or anything like that, so we can just pull it. Now, this itself might not be desirable because that would technically allow you to update the item name at runtime. So if that's not the sort of thing that you want, we do want to go ahead and set that to private. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here. Because it's private, we then do need a getter function for it. Just like so. And I am going to go ahead and make that a pure function as well. So if we jump back into the widget, if we actually compile, oh, it won't do that because we've not hooked it up. But if this was hooked up, it would flag up with an error. And what we want to do is just replace that with the get item name function. Just like so. So with that done, we can just get the actual text field itself, so the text box, and we can do the set text on that. Connect it to the is valid, and then we'll just connect in the item name. And then for the quantity, we want to do something similar, so set text. And then we can actually do a toText here if we wanted to, and you can kind of format a little bit how it will actually display the integer, so whether or not it uses like the grouping icon, for example. For me, however, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull from the in text on the text quantity and do format text. And this allows you to essentially specify kind of like inputs and dynamically decide what certain elements of the string that you provide will become. If we was to put item quantity, for example, it would just set it to item quantity. There's going to be no difference there. If we just set it to X, then that's just what it would display. But what we can actually do is if we do an open curly brace and then a name, so it could be quantity, for example, and then a closing curly brace, you'll notice that there then becomes an input on the format text, which you can connect quite a lot of things to. So in this example, what it's going to do is it's going to essentially replace that little section with whatever's inputted on here. You can add as many of those as you wanted to. So yeah, the names themselves can be whatever you want. Let me just, as an example, so let's say when you can connect things to these however you like. So that can be quite a nice way to allow you a little bit more flexibility in how you are formatting some of the text that you're displaying within your widgets. Okay, so let me just run through. So generally the idea is we're going to create this particular widget and pass an item object to it. Once we've done that, that's going to then trigger the construct once we've added it to the screen. And as a part of that, it's then going to update the text where it pulls the data from the item object and then applies it to the various widgets that we've got. Okay, so that's itself fairly straightforward. And for now, that's kind of where I'm going to leave it with the item entry widget. And what we're going to do now is move on to an item container widget. So you can kind of think of the item container widget as being what will handle creating all the individual widgets that are required to display all the different items within a specific inventory. So for this, we're going to create another user widget. I'm going to call this one item container. And the reason why I'd recommend using it as an item container widget itself is because as you're building different UI elements and things like that need to have an inventory displayed in some shape or form, ideally you want to try and make sure you're using the same item container. So in that way it already handles how all that works and it just helps keep things a little bit more consistent across your different UIs and things like that. So generally the item container, what's going to happen is when we create it, we essentially have a function on there where we pass an inventory system component to it, and it will then pull all the relevant data it needs from that to display the inventory system in question. So with that done, I'm going to open up the item container widget, and for this, again, I'm going to do an overlay. So, and I'm just going to do this just as a list. Again, this is kind of the point where you yourself can get a little bit more creative in terms of possibly what you want. If you're wanting it more of a grid system, then you can use the various panels that are available for that. So there's the so there's the different grid panels you could use for stuff like that, if that's the sort of thing that you're wanting. For me, as I mentioned, I'm just going to do it as a list. So I'm just going to use a vertical box. So I'm going to set that as a variable, and I'm just going to call this one item container box. So ultimately this is the thing that we will actually add the created item entries to once we've created them. Okay, so what I want to do now, so a quick think. I'm going to go ahead and add just a background as well, just to make it a little bit easier to see. Let's drop that behind. We'll do that as full screen. And again, I'm going to set the colour on this something fairly dark. I'll add a slight bit of opacity to it as well. Okay, and then I'm just going to switch the fill screen to design on screen again, just so we can see a bit more as to what it's going to look like. Okay, so the item container box, that's currently positioned up in the top left corner. So I'm just going to make that fill horizontally and vertically, and then add some padding to that. Let's do it for 16 for now. Okay. Now what you might want to do as well, if we just wrap the item container box with another vertical box, we can then add a horizontal box. And we can drop that just above the item container, and we can actually use that possibly for like the heading of the inventory. So inventory name. So I don't think we specify an inventory name in the inventory system. No, we don't. But obviously that's something that we can add if it's something that you desire within your specific inventory. So I'm going to just add a little bit of padding to the top of the item container box. That's just to separate it from the heading there. Okay. So in terms of the visual aspect, I'd say we're about done there. I am just going to set the image background again, just untick it so it's not a variable, and as I said, that just prevents it from showing up in the variables tab. Okay, so in terms of this particular widget, we're going to go and add a function there called initialize inventory. And for this, we want to add an input to that, which is going to be of type inventory system. That's going to be an object class. And then from here, we can get the items, convert that to an array, and that then allows us to loop through the list. Then we can do a for each loop, for each of the items, and it's at this particular point we want to create a widget, so that item entry. And then we can pass the item object to the widget it's created. And then once we've done that, we can add a child to the vertical box, and we just add that new widget that we've created. Just like so. And just in terms of the actual title name, I will quickly sort that as well. I'll do text inventory name, just like so. And then on the inventory system itself, I'm just going to add a new variable to this called inventory name, and that's going to be a text type as well. So if we go back to the item container, if we just pull this to the side a little bit, I'm going to grab the reference to the inputted inventory as a separate variable just to keep things a bit tidier. From here we can let the inventory name, and then we can set the text to that inventory name. So hopefully you're starting to sort of see how you can kind of just add and remove variables from both the inventory system and the item base, and just decide, well, this is how I want it to be displayed. So we're kind of just separating the individual widgets into their own separate tasks in a sense, and just making sure that they have access to the data that they need. So in terms of the individual item entry, that normally doesn't need to know much about the actual inventory system itself that it's in. So all we need to do is just pass the individual item we wanted to show, and then it gets all its data from there. And in terms of the item container, that only really needs to know about the inventory system, because from there it's able to get all the additional data it needs from that. Okay, so in terms of this itself, I'd say that's about done for the item container at this particular stage. And then what I'm going to do is actually go ahead and create one more widget. I'm just going to call this one inventory underscore main. And this is just going to be the main inventory that gets added to the viewport to show the inventory. So for this we do need a container, so let's start with the overlay, and then want the item container. Put that in. Now, what I'm going to do is actually just wrap that in a size box as well, and then set it to central alignment for both horizontal and vertical. That'll just make it so this box is in the center of the screen. And then for this size, we can kind of specify how big we want it to be. Uh, 512 by 512. There we go. Okay. And then with that positioned in there, we do then need to just create a function that kind of allows it to call that initialize function on the item container that we've created. Initialize inventory, because as a part of that we do need to pass in the inventory that we've got. Okay, so on construct, because it's the inventory main, we know that this is only ever going to be displayed in regards to the player's inventory. So what we can do is get the inventory system from the controlled pawn of the controller that owns the widget. Hopefully that makes sense. So we'll get the owning player. So the reference for this will be a player controller. Now, if I remember correctly, we put the infantry system onto the actual character itself. So what we can do from here, we can get the controlled pawn and then use the get component by class, inventory system, and then we'll just plug that into there, connect it all up. So now whenever this gets created, what it will do is it will get the infantry system from the player character, and it will push that to the item container, which will then get it to update essentially. Okay, so we are getting somewhere. So what we can do now is we kind of just need to control the input the player would press to show that information. So I'm going to go to the inputs folder and just create a new input action. I'm going to call this one open inventory. Like so. Yeah. And then we just want to make sure we do add that to the input mapping context as well. And I'm just going to set it to the letter E. And then we need to find a good place to pop this in. So in terms of something like this, there's a few places you can put it. You can put it in third person character or inside the controller. Now I'm not sure if we have a custom controller in here. We don't know. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop it into the player character. In terms of where you put sort of the input for triggering the menu to open, again, the character or the player controller, there's not much of a difference in terms of whether or not you'd want it. If you do have quite a few characters that can change, that the player can control, then you might prefer to have it in the player controller, because that way you're not having to repeat the logic in the characters, if that makes sense, particularly if they're quite different. But in this example, we're just going to pop it in the character. So we'll just do open inventory. So, and then we need to create the widgets. So this is going to be the inventory main. And then want to add to viewport. So, and then set. And then I do want to set the input mode to UI only. Just get the player controller. Yeah, and if this was inside the player controller, you would just be able to use self on there. But because we are in the character, we do have to specify. There we go. Okay, so if we actually go ahead and test this now, so we're going to go ahead and just pick up those 3 items. Now if I press the E key, you'll notice that the 2 items are in there. Now at the moment we don't have anything set up to close the inventory, so we're going to go ahead and quickly get that set up now. But what I am actually going to do, just before I do that, I'm just going to add a quick print string to the start of here, so on the started. Because this is kind of something that I do sort of see pop up quite frequently. Now, if I go ahead and press the E key, it's going to open, there's not going to be anything in there. But if I press E a second time, you'll notice that there's no print string at the top of the screen, which obviously isn't ideal. Adding to that, we also have no cursor. That may or may not be an issue depending if you're going for controller support or not. But obviously you can just enable the mouse cursor if you need to on the player controller. But because we do set the input mode to UI only, this input action can't fire. It doesn't receive any of the inputs from the main system. Now just so you can see that again, so press it here the first time, we'll get the print string. So I'm pressing it again now, and we're not getting that print string. So we can't use the same method for closing the inventory as we do opening it. Now, you do kind of have 2 options really. Now, one is instead of setting it to input mode UI, you can set the input mode to game and UI. And this will kind of give you some of that functionality back. Now personally, I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing this, and I'll kind of explain why in a second. So I've just unhooked the set UI mode only and done for the game and UI instead. Now if I press E, obviously it pops up and we get the open inventory. Now if I press it again, it still functions. At this point we now have 2 inventories on the screen, which, you know, but it's working. So what we could do is we could store a reference to this specific widget, and if it's valid, then we know we need to destroy it. If it's not valid, then we know we need to create it. That's kind of one thing we can do here. But the issue you kind of have is when it's game and UI, generally the UI will get inputs first, and then anything that's not handled by the UI then trickles down to the game inputs, as it were. As your project gets more complicated and you have more inputs happening and things like that, it can become a little bit more difficult to keep track of what inputs are actually being used when specific bits of UI are open. So generally what I would tend to say is, unless you actually need the player to be able to sort of move around whilst bits of UI is open that you also want the player to navigate, it's usually best to go for UI only, because that prevents any of those inputs from bubbling down to the game that might cause other actions. Of course, just a recommendation. It's kind of one of those things that you might have to have a play around with and see what kind of fits best with the sorts of interactions that you're going to have. Now, as an example for the game and UI input, kind of the first thing that I kind of think of is kind of like the selection radials that you might get for weapons. I think Horizon Zero Dawn, they have theirs where you can still move around while you're selecting a weapon, but that particular radial menu does have inputs. I believe it's for the right analog stick, but you can still move around using the left analog stick. So that's kind of an example of when you might want to be using game and UI, because you kind of have those 2 things that need to work together. But again, have a play around with that and see what you want to kind of do. Now, for the method that I will sort of go with on this one is, because we are using input mode UI only, we kind of have to go through and use the input system in the widgets itself. So if we go back to the inventory main, if we go to the function section at the top here and click where it says override, there's a few different options that we have. So we have on key down, and then there's on key up, and then I believe there's a few others for like the mouse and things like that. So I'm going to use the on key up, I think. No, not key up. I'm going to use on key down. And what will happen is whenever this particular widget is in focus, which in this example will be because we provide it as the focus within the set input mode UI only, it will then receive inputs that will trigger this particular function. Generally it tends to start with the core focus, so that's any child widgets that you have, and then if that doesn't handle the widgets, it goes to its parent. If that doesn't handle it, it'll go to its parent, and so forth, until eventually it just stops. So what we can do, we have this in key event. Now what we need to do is actually get the input key, so the actual key that's been pressed, and we need to compare that. So in this case I'm going to press that to E, do a branch. So if that's true, so we've pressed the E key, what I'm going to do is just remove from parent. And that's going to be just in regards to the infantry main. So because this is going to be the main widget, once it gets removed from the parent, it's gone. We're not storing a reference of it anywhere, so that'll allow it to get garbage collected as well. Now the last thing to deal with is just this return node. So we do need to specify whether or not this specific input was handled or not. So for that we can do the handled. So by default, where we have a false, if we don't hook anything up, it will automatically return unhandled, which allows other widgets to try and handle that specific input if so desired. So now with that done, if we give it a try, still not working. Okay. So a quick check, is it making it to this? So what I'm going to do is send a quick breakpoint to the branch within the infantry main. So I want to check to see, okay, so it's not quite getting to it. So it looks like there's possibly an issue with it focusing. Push inputs. Lock. Guess it's still not doing it. Okay. Let me have a quick check. Right, okay, yeah. So this main infantry main is not actually set to being focusable. So what you can do under the class defaults, there is focusable. So if you give that a tick, that means that it can be focused and thus receive the inputs. Let's try that again. There we go. I'm just going to remove that breakpoint. Okay, so now it has removed it, but we still can't move. And the reason why is because we are now still in UI mode. So what we can do is set the inputs again. So set input mode, and I'm going to set that back to game only. For the player controller, we can get the owning player. So that's the owner of this specific widget. Now if we try it, so we open the infantry, press it again, it closes it, and we can move around again. So pick up the items, you can see those how we want. Now press Q to drop an item. You can see how that's starting to update. Okay. So yeah, so that's a very quick overview on setting up some of the UI elements to kind of display some of that data for our items. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this specific episode here. Hopefully you found this useful, and I certainly plan to revisit some of the UI personally myself, I found that most of my time making an inventory system is setting up the widgets themselves, so it can be quite complex, especially when we get to more complex features that you might want to add to your inventory system. But for now, we've got the inventory system itself, the item objects, and we're now able to start displaying some of that data in widgets. So yeah, thanks for watching the video. If you do like it, do leave a like, and by all means do subscribe so you don't miss any future videos in the series. And yeah, just want to say thanks for watching and take care.